Newsies is a strange movie. Before the first chorus of the opening song of the film, we learn the following facts about the titular newsboys. They smoke, they steal, they're orphans, they're opportunists, they're womanizers, they're profiteers, and their bowel movements are exceptionally stinky. The film prominently features several riots, the wanton beating of strikebreakers, including adult-on-adult, child-on-child, and adult-on-child, extensive police violence, exploitative practices on the part of a for-profit prison, judicial corruption, multiple jailbreaks, blackmail, light stalking, mild to moderate anti-Semitism.
So did you miss me, Weasel?
The name is Weisel. Mr. Weisel to you.
And child labor. Just an absolute ton of child labor. Oh, and did I mention it's a musical for children? Because it's a musical for children. Released by Disney in 1992, Newsies is a live-action musical about the historical Newsboys' strike of 1899. On the surface, Newsies is a story about a ragtag band of misfits taking on the establishment and winning. But like so much in media targeted at children, there's a broad gulf between what Newsies thinks it's doing and what it's actually doing. I think it wants to be a story about how the weak together are strong and how standing up for one's rights will always be rewarded. But if you stop and really look at it for a while, you start to see the ways in which the world Newsies shows us has some much more complicated and more unsettling things to say about workers' rights, about how capital wields power, and about how the media can cultivate narratives that celebrate workers in theory while reinforcing capitalist hegemony in practice. Any effort to fully document the peculiarities of Newsies would take far longer than the runtime of the film. But if there's one thing I must say at the outset, it is this. I love Newsies deeply. And I have for most of my life. But I'm also aware that almost everything about it is, to some degree, real bad. Like, there are some movies that are so bad they're good. And there are other movies that are interesting because or in spite of their badness. But Newsies is not one of these. Newsies is bad and good. Both bad and good, thoroughly, deeply, and to the bone, and both at the same time. The only bad thing about Newsies is everything, but the only good thing about Newsies is everything. It is perfect in the way that one's spouse might be perfect. Full of deep and sometimes even obvious flaws, but nonetheless, in every way, exactly right.
We recognize that there are people who haven't seen Newsies. In fact, I was one of them until very recently. If you are one such unfortunate, we encourage you to stop what you're doing and watch it now, immediately. We assure you there's nothing better you can do for the next 2 hours. For those of you who will not do so, here is a laughably inadequate summary of the plot of Newsies. The main action of the film is precipitated by Joseph Pulitzer, portrayed by Robert Duvall, realizing that he could increase the profits of the New York World by increasing the cost of the paper, not to the consumer, but to the distributors, the newsies, the young boys who would stand on street corners and cry the headlines to passers-by. Instead of charging the newsboys 50 cents for 100 papes, Pulitzer could charge them 60 cents for 100. He runs the numbers and realizes that the potential profits are substantial. The newsies, already living hand to mouth, are brought to a froth by the price increase. Having lately been steeped in headlines about the trolley workers' strike, and having watched the violence as union workers destroyed cars and tracks, Newsies newcomer Dave, played by David Moscow, pushes the boys toward a strike. Acting as a sort of Cesar Chavez de Bergerac, Dave feeds lines to the more charismatic and well-established Jack Cowboy Kelly, played by an intolerably young Christian Bale. With the help of some adult allies in the form of New York Sun reporter Brian Denton, Bill Pullman, and self-employed burlesque performer Meta Larson, Anne Margaret, Jack and Dave are able to rally the newsboys of all 5 boroughs to the cause. When Pulitzer issues a press ban on any news of the strike, Denton helps the boys write and publish their own paper, the Newsies Banner, which the boys print without permission on an antiquated press in what I believe is Joseph Pulitzer's basement. The banner allows the Newsies to spread the strike to all of the city's child workers. After all of this, Pulitzer is finally swayed to submit to the Newsies' demands, apparently mostly because he dislikes yelling. Teddy Roosevelt is also there. It's a lot. And I mean, we left out not one, but two failed Prison Breaks, the parts they ripped off from Les Mis,
Sullivan! Wait till I get you back to the refuge!
parts they ripped off from Mary Poppins, and the dance number where Jack steals a horse just to ride it one block for dramatic effect. Newsies is a deeply inexplicable movie, and it's hard to say anything about its content without first trying to work through an obvious question. How does a film like Newsies come to be?
YouTuber Zach Pasley has already explored some of the development history of the film and the collection of oddities that it represents. It premieres between The Little Mermaid and Aladdin, right in the midst of the Disney Renaissance. Pasley suggests that Disney's live-action division in the early 90s wasn't quite sure what to do with itself.
Meanwhile, Disney-branded live-action has a lot of question marks floating around it. How do we make live-action family films? What do families want to see in the early 90s? One of the results of this line of thinking was Newsies.
But in all truthfulness, to describe Newsies as a result of thinking seems like possibly an overstatement. Rather, I think Newsies was a sort of emergent property, the product of an almost completely unintentional series of decisions made by various executives without any guiding hand. And because the various visions guiding that process were fundamentally in conflict with one another, the film that resulted was, by necessity, conflicted. Pasley includes a more thorough narrative of the production changes, and I encourage you to go watch his video if you'd like a little bit more of this story. But in short, the creative team behind Newsies was as follows, displayed alongside their most prominent pre-Newsies work for convenience. We have writers Bob Tudeker and Noni White, who were attempting to write a period drama, producer Michael Finnell, who is most familiar with action and horror, Jeffrey Katzenberg trying to bring the film in line with the Disney Renaissance, Kenny Ortega, also known as Olivia Newton-John's choreographer in his directorial debut, Alan Menken, who is reliably perfect at writing music for Disney princesses, and lyricist Jack Feldman, who as far as I can tell just happened to be walking by. There was no unified vision for the film, but rather a boatload of disparate visions that were all chipping in strange decisions as they went. And a fair number of these decisions are Disney trying to make a story about capital's exploitative relationship with labor into a fun romp. This tension is what makes Newsies the bizarre masterpiece that it is. And before we dig into the problems that tension creates, I want to rest here for a moment, because somehow Newsies is a fun romp about capital's exploitative relationship with labor. Somehow this does add up to this. As much as this conflicted vision creates problems in the film, it's also this tension that creates so much of what I love about Newsies. Because of this tension, Marty Belafsky was cast to play the historical figure of Crutchy Morris, a leader in the Newsboys Union who served as the organization's secretary, and then ended up having to do a ton of choreography as if he only had one working leg. Because of this tension, one of the lesser Newsies in Jack's entourage is called Snipe Shooter, which I think we're supposed to think is because he's good with a slingshot. Actually, the name Snipe Shooter is a term for someone who smokes cigar stubs they pick out of the gutter. And perhaps best of all, because of this tension, serious young actor Christian Bale, who is not blessed with vocal talent or dancing ability, signed a contract to work on a period drama about a labor dispute, and subsequently found himself singing a love song to Santa Fe, New Mexico, while riding the shoulders of his stunt coordinator who was pretending to be a horse. Newsies feels like everyone showed up for the first day of filming expecting to be on set for a completely different film. And nonetheless, every single one of them set out to make the best damn whatever the hell this is they possibly could. Much of the movie's charm lives in the earnest beauty of a whole cast of young actors failing with spectacular enthusiasm at many of the most basic elements of a musical. As podcaster Sarah Marshall said of the film, it's some kids who can sing, some kids who can do gymnastics, and some kids who can act, and almost none of them will be the same kids. But wherever their talents were or weren't, everybody on set brought everything they had to the movie. And so that's what Newsies is. Everyone's everything, like right there on film. Sweaty and gasping and breathless, a movie that could never have been made on purpose.
So the thing we want to bring to the foreground in all the tensions of this movie is the subject matter. As Racetrack tells us at the beginning of the movie, Newsies is based on the actual events of the Newsboys' strike of 1899 and the newsboys themselves. Speaking historically, the first newsboy was 10-year-old Bernard Flaherty, an Irish immigrant who responded to a job listing in the New York Sun. The Sun had been expecting to attract adults with their listing, by which they hoped to extend their customer base. At the time, papers could be purchased at news offices and in some stores, which limited sales to those who intentionally sought them out. An innovator, Flaherty stood on street corners and shouted sensational versions of the day's news, hoping to sell papers he'd purchased from the Sun at a discount to passers-by. This distribution method turned out to be immensely effective, and by the 1870s there were thousands of newsboys in New York City, largely the children of Irish and German immigrant families, some as young as 6 years old. Although they were often homeless or living cramped, unsanitary lives in lodging houses, they weren't generally orphans. They were simply the children of the very poor, and as such, they were often separated from their families by circumstance or necessity. They were largely literate, as they needed to be able to read the papers they sold in order to determine what to shout to attract buyers on their corners. Newsboys were not only keenly aware of the trade unionism that was changing the landscape of labor in the late 19th century, but also very clearly inspired by it, as they developed strong fraternal bonds amongst themselves. When a newsboy died, his fellow workers provided full, respectable funeral rites for their comrade, including, at times, processions through the city inspired by those they had witnessed for President Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and Horace Greeley. He'll be back in a minute. In addition, newsboys became the subject of concern and creative endeavor within their society. Songs, sermons, poems, drawings, and photographs of newsboys were very popular, particularly among the charity-minded middle class. Scientific philanthropists, generally college-educated women, understood child labor to be the cause of urban poverty rather than a side effect, and they established reformatories and other charity programs to try to end the practice. Sentimental depictions of tragic street urchins, tinged with Christian rhetoric, proved useful in acquiring public support and funding. The newsboys weren't unaware of their circumstances, of course. They witnessed their own suffering, but they didn't sentimentalize it. When Joseph Whistlin' Joe Rathburn, who had planned to become a musician, died after a week-long illness, his fellow newsboys at Success magazine closed his obituary with these words: "He should have lived longer." And when 11-year-old Alfred Williams ended his own life by poison, his colleagues buried him beneath a memorial they paid for that read, "This boy committed suicide because of the hardships of life." The newsboys knew their mistreatment for what it was. They were just far more interested in organizing and improving their lives alongside other labor movements than in being rescued by outsiders who misunderstood and misrepresented them. Their first strike was in 1886, when the Brooklyn Times attempted to increase sales in some areas by selling papers to newsboys at a lower cost. This strike only lasted 9 days, but it did demonstrate the power newsboys had as organized labor. When rumors of a price hike arose in 1889, the newsboys repeated their protest before learning the allegations were untrue. In 1898, nearly a decade later, the Journal and the World did raise their prices as news of the Spanish-American War increased circulation. By the summer of 1899, the war died down and sales did too, and the newsboys found themselves unable to manage their increased costs. They voted to form an official union. More on that later. Elected leaders announced their intent to strike and requested arbitration with their papers. Their papers ignored them. Think for a moment about those boys and girls, the child laborers of 1899, young and determined and hard put upon by the media megalith attempting to squeeze every tenth of a cent of profit out of them. Newsies fought in the streets and marched through the city, relying on charity to stay alive, while the media superpowers that employed them used all their resources to protect their right to exploit children. Because there's a surprising amount of historicity here when you start digging. Most of the newsies, Kid Blink, Racetrack Higgins, Crutchy Morris, Spot Conlon, Boots McAleenan, were real people. Boots was 11 and was striking because earning 40 cents for 100 papers wasn't enough to keep him in cigarettes. There was another guy on the board of the Newsboys Union, Crazy Arborn. He wasn't a newsie. They gave him a spot on the committee because he donated 1,500 pretzels to the newsies to keep them from starving. And this is what Disney decided to make into a feel-good musical. Are we uncomfortable yet? Newsies took the strife and struggle of child workers in 1899 and then hired more child workers in 1992 to sing and dance and make it all jolly. And perhaps the most discomforting part is that Katzenberg was, after all, right. The period drama about child laborers fighting for their rights that Zuidecker and White had imagined simply wasn't a film that Disney could make. And so, Newsies is born out of the conflicts arising from Disney attempting to make a movie that, quite simply, fundamentally cannot be a Disney movie. Here's a 30-second example. The film opens on a statue of Horace Greeley. The camera pans up to reveal 4 young children, sleeping, shoeless, filthy, and ragged. 3 sleep uncovered on the cold cement of the statue's plinth, and a 4th is cradled in the old reformer's lap. As the offices of the New York World enter the frame, we smash cut to presses printing at intolerable speeds, adult workers in and among the machinery, by comparison strong, hale, and alert. This is a great place to start a period drama about the newsboys' strike of 1899 for a lot of reasons. For one, such a statue did stand outside the offices of the New York World, which in 1899 faced Publisher Square along with Greeley's paper, The Tribune. Greeley wrote about the disconnect between printers and their employees. In 1850, he addressed the printers of New York, complaining that in his 18 years in the city, "I have never heard of a meeting of printers to consider and discuss the rights generally of labor, the causes of its depression, the means of its advancement." The smash cut to the presses evokes Greeley's argument about technology. "I have heard complaints that machinery and invention do not work for the laboring class, but rather against them." Greeley lambasted the printers and, in fairness, workers themselves, for being glaringly unfaithful to themselves in knowledge and devotion to the interests and rights of labor. The solution, Greeley argued, was a universal union of workers. Again, as a set piece for a period drama about labor organization, this opening is fantastic. But when we watch it again with sound, well, the music is light and upbeat, the trills on the piano are fun, the driving bass pushes the horns into a series of rising chords that tell us, this is gonna be great, look how goofy these kids are, sleeping outdoors. Horace Greeley's only there because he's the guy who said, "Go west, young man," and cowboy, he wants to go to Santa Fe. This movie is going to be an adventure. You don't need shoes or a bed for an adventure.
Editor Dad here. It's worth pointing out that the Newsies themselves explicitly subscribe to this philosophy, and the dissonance between the anti-exploitation melodrama and the high kick-in caper could not be more clear than in the lyrics to the tune this intro sets up, Carrying the Banner.
Just give me half a cup, something to wake me up. I gotta find an angle. I gotta sell more papers. We goes where we wishes, weeds as free as fishes, sure beats washing dishes, what a fine life. Carrying the banner home for you. How I gonna make ends meet? We need a good assassination. We need an earthquake or a war.
It's right there on the surface. Anyway, back to Mom.
Because Disney can't make a period drama about child suffering where the media corporation is the villain. So instead, it made a musical. And almost everywhere you look in that musical, you will find that Newsies takes the serious and makes it silly. And if you scratch at the happy-go-lucky goofball veneer, you will find that just beneath the surface is a hidden condemnation of the exploitative relationship between capital and labor.
With that in mind, let's look at perhaps the silliest thing in Newsies. Every single word spoken by almost any character. If you've heard even a single line from Newsies, you'll be aware that the dialect and accents in this film are cartoonishly ridiculous. And in fact, the music and the absurd dialect it contains is another place where the tension between the desire to make a period drama and the desire to make a kid-friendly marketable commodity is starkly visible if you know where to look. Newsies' music is a collaboration between Alan Menken and Jack Feldman, one of whom you have heard of. Whether you realize it or not, you know Alan Menken's work intimately. He's written almost all of the best music to come out of the Disney Corporation since 1990. The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Pocahontas, Hercules, countless others. When Phil Johnston wanted to write a parody of a Disney princess song for the anti-princess Vanellope von Schweetz to sing in Ralph Breaks the Internet, Alan Menken ended up writing A Place Called Slaughter Race, which is both a perfect Disney princess song and a perfect parody of a Disney princess song.
Welcome back, watch your head. Hate to see you end up dead.
Let's get this party rolling.
Is that appliance stolen?
Alan Menken is a musical wizard. Jack Feldman, on the other hand, is the co-writer of Copacabana, and that's about it. According to IMDb, between Newsies the film and Newsies the Broadway musical, Feldman had exactly one songwriting credit. It was the theme song for an episode of The Wobulous World of Dr. Seuss. If there is one person who defines what Newsies is, it is Jack Feldman, who managed to win both a Razzie and a Tony for his work on Newsies. The same music is, at the same time, as good and as bad as Hollywood can get. And these lyrics, just woof. Some of them are almost unsingable. Some of them are tone deaf and incongruous.
And we'll kick their rear.
Some of them are just non sequiturs.
No snoozer. Sitting makes me antsy.
And some just seem to be words, because Menken wrote some notes, so Feldman had to have someone say something.
Move your elbow past the towel.
But in fairness to Feldman, some of them are also legitimately sublime. In The World Will Know, for example, Feldman plays with the synecdoche between the world, as in everyone, and the world, as in Pulitzer's newspaper, in some fantastic ways. The lyrics and language of Newsies are cartoonish, full of hoists and goyles and muddas and fadas, and more than anything, papes. And it's easy to say that the Newsies sound ridiculous because, let's be clear, they absolutely do. Racetrack is the only Newsie who sounds like he might ever have met a New Yorker.
Glum and dumb. What's the matter with you?
Davey doesn't even bother trying an accent.
Just a bunch of angry kids with no money.
Boots is doing
Stop someone else from selling our pay.
Boots, and everyone else sounds like a caricature. But here's the thing. The lyrics and the absurd dialect and accents are all, at least in part, caused by, predictably, conflicts between capital and labor. They sound like caricatures because they're based on caricatures. Specifically, they're based on caricatures done of the striking newsboys by the press during the strike in 1899. This is an article on the strikes called Newsboys' Word Stands from the July 23, 1899 issue of the New York Daily Tribune. It's Kid Blink, the historical counterpart of Jack, describing a fight he had with a strikebreaker.
Did you hear how we done up de scabs dis morning? No? Well, it happens dis-a-way. Me and de Corp was feelin' our blinks to see how de land lay, when two mugs come outen dat office down dere, and from de way der coats bulged I knowed dey was hidin' somethin'. I blowed me toot, and it didn't take more'n a hinnet to get de gang onto it. De scabe had more'n 100 papes concealt onto their persons, and say you'd a taught you was in a snowstorm.
There's plenty of examples of this kind of use of dialect in the contemporary newspapers, but it's worth lingering on this one for a moment because it's one that we can say with confidence that Sudeker and White had in front of them as they were writing Newsies. In this scene, Jack delivers a line about demanding to see Pulitzer that is taken not just word for word, but sound for sound from that same article.
So that's when I says to him, listen, I ain't in the habit of transacting no business with office boys.
Newsies made it seem like the Sun was the only paper to cover the strike, and only until the rally at Irving Hall, but that's not true. Lots of papers did. They just didn't cover it empathetically or neutrally. They were never on the newsboys' side. This was, after all, the age of yellow journalism, and the press was more interested in what would sell than what was true. They had an incentive to sensationalize, and these ridiculous Utes were a lot more entertaining than a simple presentation of the merits of the newsboys' case. The most absurd example we've come across comes from the Morning Telegraph. After the rally at Irving Hall, a newsboy calling himself, forgive me, the smut-faced Guinea, showed up at the Telegraph's offices claiming to be the new leader of the Union. Now, bear in mind, there is no mention of this person in any other contemporary newspaper article I've been able to find. Here's how the Telegraph printed the interview.
Then after it was all over, me Comet goes down to see Hoist and Pullets. I meets Hoist in the hallway of the Choinalt building, and I says, say Hoist, what the hell? Hoist gives me the bovine laugh and says he, quit your kiddin'. I would be right, flings a biff at Hoist's face, but that bloke's a fly guy and he tumbles to the concrete.
Next, I turns to Pullets. Say, Joe, I says I, holding me right hand to me right hand like I had de cush. What to eel? Der World will not, says Pullets, he says, and I wid me waitin' left turns him onto the bad wig and offswing. Pullet dumps too, and seeing there ain't no use, I goes out again with the bunch.
Let me say this again. A random guy, calling himself the Smutface Guinea, showed up at the offices of the Telegraph, said he was the leader of the Newsboys Union, and told them that he punched out Joe Pulitzer with one hand and Bill Hearst with the other, and the Telegraph printed it. Like this. I mean, it's pretty obvious that due diligence isn't exactly high on the Telegraph's priority list at this point in their history. They just want to give this schmuck some column space because they think it's funny. They think it's entertaining, that it'll sell papers, and that it'll undermine the credibility of the labor strike, challenging the profitability of their industry. So almost every paper printed almost every interview with the newsboy in this dialect because it made the strikers look uneducated, low class, and silly. That the press is using this dialect to make the newsboys look foolish is highlighted by this passage from that same Tribune article from earlier, in reference to a letter from a newsboy. The letter is hardly a model of orthography, and if John Wilson expects to emulate the example of some great men who have risen from the ranks, he will need to take a few innings with English grammar and a dictionary. They were saying it out loud. Get a load of these idiots. And the newsboys, for their part, knew that the papers were doing this, and knew the effect it had. According to the Times, David, who seems accurately portrayed in the film as both the most sensible and the most boring of the newsies, specifically asked that, quote, the newspaper reporters present shouldn't quote the speakers as saying D's and do's and you's. The Times, at least, seems to have honored this request, and as a result, Kid Blink's speech reads as much more legitimate.
10 cents in the dollar is as much to us as it is to Mr. Hearst, the millionaire. We can do more with 10 cents than he can with 25. Well, that was oddly normal.
And look, it's just impossible to watch Newsies without thinking that these kids are all just terrible actors and that none of them can do a passable New York accent. We did it ourselves just a few minutes ago. Editor Dad popping in to say that it's worth pointing out here, it's almost impossible to read these lines without sounding just as ridiculous as these child actors did. I asked my collaborators to record their first read of these quotes, and listening to them struggle through it, it's equal parts madcap goofballery and anguished discomfort. It's fantastic. Take a listen.
Silliness commencing. Prepare to record.
Oh boy.
Well, it happens this way.
Meets Hoist in the hallway of the Choinalt building. And
say Hoist, what tell? What to hell? What tell?
I know they was hiding something.
And says, say, he says. Wait, so he says, and then he says.
Whew. That didn't even feel like English.
Didn't take more than a hint. Oh, fuck me.
Wow.
God, you make me sound like some kind of like fucking Eton upper class freak who can't speak the language of the common folk. Jesus Christ.
Well, enjoy listening to me do that.
And let me be really clear, none of these people are idiots. They may sound that way when you listen to these recordings, but that's kind of the point. So did the actors in Newsies. But as with so many things in the Newsies, what's really happening is that Disney is recapitulating the same anti-labor practices that the World and Journal employed in 1899. In 1899, the newspapers used weird dialect and accents to make the newsboys sound funny, foolish, uneducated, and silly. And in 1992, Disney let those same papers decide how the strikers would be portrayed nearly a century later. And as a result, the child laborers working on the film sounded funny, foolish, uneducated, silly, and bad at their jobs. This goofy-sounding accent is effectively re-weaponized against labor after almost 100 years.
But before we condemn it as capitalist propaganda, let's let Newsies speak for itself for a moment, shall we? Because it definitely doesn't think it's on the side of capital. Just before Grandpa Greeley and his shoeless scamps introduce us to the world of the film, Newsies gives us a paragraph of voiceover, giving some historical context. It asks us to listen to the great chorus of the Newsies' voices, echoing through the streets of New York, to imagine them standing on every corner, a ragged army of poor orphans and runaways who work for you, bringing you the headlines. And on the other side of the line from this haggard force of destitutes are the giants, Pulitzer, Hearst, and a few others. Denton even lampshades the image explicitly.
David as in David and Goliath?
The story wants to be about the little guy in an exceptionally literal way, standing up to the powerful and winning. The imagery throughout the film is clear. Together, we are strong. At the end of the film, the Newsies win. Pulitzer agrees to bring the price back to where it was before the strike. There's a big party in the streets. Jack raises his arms and cries, "We beat 'em!" for all the world to hear. Mr. Weisel and the Delancey brothers inexplicably leave work in a huff, just to show how thoroughly they've been beaten. The day has been seized. The world knows. Even Snyder, the movie's Inspector Javert, who has been pursuing Jack throughout the film, is locked in the back of his own paddy wagon for being a bad warden. All the wrongs of the world have been righted, right? It feels like there needs to be more in this section in terms of the work we're trying to do in this essay, but at the same time, there's just not that much more to say. The movie thinks it's simple. The movie thinks it's an underdog tale, the little guys standing together in the face of overwhelming odds and with nothing but spit and vinegar delivering a well-aimed shot right into the rear end of capitalism. Newsies wants so badly to be simple, but like almost everything else, it manages to fail beautifully at that too.
So, here's the first problem. The Newsies don't win. Or rather, the Newsies battle isn't won because the Newsies unionize. The Newsies battle is won because existing structures of capitalist power decide that the Newsies should win. There's no particular reason to believe that Pulitzer's strategy of hiring armed men to beat the living hell out of children would not have been successful in the end. And indeed, it's clear that in the early days of the strike, Pulitzer even has the support of law enforcement.
Aren't you gonna stop him, sir? Just move along, mister.
What changes the tide for the Newsies is the fact that other entrenched authorities decide to use their clout to undermine Pulitzer and Hearst. A small but obvious example of this is Meta Larkson. One of the earliest forces driving the growth of the strike is the rally held at Irving Hall. This rally, where a bunch of newsboys who, within the narrative of the film, live pape to pape on halfpenny profits and sleep more or less in one another's armpits, managed to commandeer the use of a large auditorium for the purpose of labor organizing. The only reason we find this at all believable is that we've already established that Jack has an, uncommonly close relationship with Meta Larkson.
You wouldn't kick me out without a kiss goodbye, would you, Meta?
Irving Hall's headliner and apparent proprietress. So, Newsies' Guide to Unionizing Step 1 gained the support of the owner of a large arena and convinced them to let you use it for free. Next, consider our man Denton, who begins covering the strike as a way to improve his own career prospects, which he does. He has the support of his paper, The Sun, a direct competitor to the World and Journal. For a time, The Sun covers the strike because it is explicitly in their corporate interests to do so. Undermining Hearst and Pulitzer increases circulation for The Sun, and supporting the strike decreases profits for the World and Journal. When the owners of The Sun decided it was no longer in their interest, their support was withdrawn. As Denton says of the rally, if it's not in the papers, it never happened. The owners decreed that it not be in the papers. This seems to spell doom for the strike. So, Newsies' Guide to Unionizing, Step 2, have your cause become explicitly profitable to a media corporation and ensure that it remains so. Of course, the Newsies managed to recover from the Sun's withdrawal of support by printing their own newspaper, the Newsies Banner, which they do by stealing a press from Joseph Pulitzer himself. They gain access to this press because Jack, having briefly been bought off by Pulitzer, is sleeping in the basement of the printing house. So, Step 3, gain unrestricted access to corporate resources. And finally, what truly makes the difference, Governor Teddy Roosevelt. Denton, who once covered Roosevelt as a war correspondent, brings the cause of the newsboys directly to Roosevelt, who is appalled by their treatment.
Disgraceful, Denty. Those poor boys.
Step 4, Teddy Roosevelt. Newsies wants to be about David and Goliath, about the Newsies banding together and standing up for their rights. But it's not. To mix giant metaphors, it's much more the scene in the ill-advised Hobbit movie where Bilbo and the dwarves are swung about wildly by two giants in a completely unrelated fight. Newsies wants to be about the power of the worker, but ultimately what it really shows us is the entrenched nature of capital and power. Here's the second problem. The Newsies don't win. The ending of Newsies is also just completely, essentially a failure to do what the film wants. The entirety of the film is a return to the status quo. The exploited child laborers living under Clockman's iron derby at the boarding house, stacked 3 high and 6 deep in bunk beds and living hand to mouth on the charity of nuns, smoking and stealing and pooping odiously, praying for a good assassination so that they might sell just one more pape. That's what the Newsies won. That's what they were fighting for, going back to how things were before the price hike. Sleeping in the cold metal arms of Horace Greeley, bread lines with bereft mothers belting their grief at the top of their vocal range. One towel for dozens of kids. Victory.
So, if the movie Newsies won the right to go back to the happy destitution where the film began, the historical Newsboys won even less than that. In reality, the Newsboys didn't even get what they wanted. Pulitzer didn't back down on price, though the Newsboys were able to convince Hearst and Pulitzer to buy back unsold papers.
Editor Dad here with a couple of quick interjections. This historical thread about the papers buying back unsold copies is present in the movie in a couple of weird lines.
"'Cause it's 2 for a penny. If I take too many, Weasel just makes me eat 'em after."
As a kid, I always took those lines literally, which actually makes Mr. Weisel a much better villain.
So in the short term, they won the right to cut their losses. But in the long term, well, one thing led to another, and now Uber drivers can work 12 hours a day at less than minimum wage with no overtime pay. Really, it's a straight line from one to the other. We wouldn't blame you for thinking that all of this stuff, the cigar-smoking newsboys of New York and their fight with rich men who share their names with journalism prizes and huge corporations, was ancient history, far removed from the concerns and clashes of labor today. But in fact, the Newsboys and the strike of 1899 have played a profound role in shaping labor rights in the United States, and their story didn't end in a triumphant carriage ride with Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, it didn't end at all for nearly half a century, and there's an argument to be made that it still hasn't ended today. Remember when I said that the historical Newsboys voted to form an official union in 1899? Hearst and Pulitzer didn't believe that Newsies had the right to form a union, as they didn't consider newsboys to be employees. Instead, the papers viewed the strike as an attempted boycott by disgruntled merchants, and although they eventually reached an agreement with the newsboys after a few weeks, they never backed down on this point. Newsboys couldn't strike, actually, because newsboys were not employees of the newspaper. They were something else.
And here's interjection number 2. This point is rammed home pretty emphatically by an article from the New York World, published on August 3rd, 1899. This is before bylines, so it's hard to know who wrote it, but it's easy to imagine that whoever it was just basically taking dictation from Pulitzer. In it, the World asserts that there is no strike here, the World has never employed a non-union employee, and they present an allegedly unsolicited letter from the various unions that represent the paper's workers, asserting that the World is a friend to unions. The premise of the piece is pretty obvious. Newsboys can't strike because newsboys can't unionize because newsboys are not employees.
The disagreement about the nature of the newsboys' work wasn't resolved until 1944, when, in response to the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, the newsboys successfully argued before the Supreme Court, like the big one, that workers who sold papers full-time were, in fact, employees of their newspaper organizations. And in response to this decision, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which excluded supervisors and independent contractors from union protections. After nearly 50 years, Hearst and Pulitzer's original stance was codified into law. The newsboys weren't employees, but independent contractors, and as such, they are part of the 53% of United States workers to whom the National Labor Relations Act simply does not apply. After all that time, and even with all of those gains made for labor, the newsboys lost. And they're still losing. In the year of our Lord 2020, 121 years after the Newsboys won, almost the exact same thing happened again. That August, a California court ruled that drivers for apps like Uber and Lyft were in fact employees of those companies. They were initially given 10 days to comply, but they requested and got an extension until November 4th, 2020, the day after the next election. And Capitol, as always, wasted no time in circumventing the American legislative process. By the time the court ruled against them, a corporate cabal, including Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, and Instacart, had already gotten Proposition 22 on the ballot for the upcoming election. This ballot measure would formally reclassify app-based transportation and delivery drivers as independent contractors rather than employees. They made it look nice on the surface. For instance, the initiative included a stipulation that drivers would earn 120% of local minimum wage, but only when they actually had riders in their vehicles, not during the time they spent waiting. The California Legislative Office estimates most drivers earn between $11 and $16 an hour, which means many drivers earn below California's minimum wage of $14 an hour. As independent contractors, drivers wouldn't be entitled to overtime pay or paid sick leave, nor would they be able to unionize. By Election Day, those companies had spent $205 million promoting Proposition 22. They forced their workers, whose employment protections would be stripped by Prop 22, to distribute Yes on 22 campaign materials as part of their job. It was the single most expensive ballot measure in California history. What Capitol was able to spend promoting the initiative was more than 10 times what labor could raise to combat it. And it passed, because of course it did. App-based drivers in 2020 followed the same path that the Newsboys had more than a century before. They fought for their rights, they took their employers to court, and they convinced the courts to tell their employers, it is against the law for you to treat your employees like that. And then their employers brought the tremendous wealth of corporate capital to bear on the legislative process and got the laws changed. See, there's this tendency to understand history as a continuous march of progress. A problem arises, the forces of good align to fight it with whatever they have, and then things get better. As time goes by, injustice gets smaller, the world gets more and more fair, and the distance between here and utopia is increasingly halved until everything is pretty much great for everyone. That's how Disney movies want the world to work, in part because they're made for children, and children are generally to be protected from complexity. But there's another, darker reason to tell stories this way. It absolves the powerful from whatever ways they're currently abusing the powerless. I mean, the Walt Disney Company might not be perfect, but look at these evil mustache-having newspaper tycoons, stealing pennies from the pockets of impoverished children. The injustices of today are tiny compared to what was happening 100 years ago. And the thing is, things are better today than they were 100 years ago, in a lot of ways. One that stuck out to me as I watched Newsies for the first time is that unlike the Newsboys of 1899, the child actors playing them in 1992 had significant workplace protections, including at least 3 hours per day of studio-provided schooling and the presence of a parent or guardian and studio teacher and labor law representative at all times. They could only be at work for 8 to 10 hours a day, including their schooling time, depending on their age. They couldn't work for more than 6 days in a row, and they had to have access to a safe place to play and rest. As a society, we don't expect any children to have to work, but in rare cases where children in the United States work, they're very well protected. It's not perfect, and exploitation and abuse can and do still happen, but it's nothing like it was, right? Well, yes and no. We're teachers in an area dominated by the agriculture industry, and many of our students grew up in households where they were often tasked with assisting their parents with migrant farm work to help make ends meet. So child labor in the US does extend beyond the entertainment industry. The International Labor Alliance estimates that globally 10% of all children are laborers, which is 152 million children. Half of those work in hazardous conditions, and almost half are under the age of 11. About 70% work in agriculture, producing food that you've probably consumed today, like chocolate, coffee, bananas. Child labor didn't go away as a result of the progressive movement in the early days of the 20th century. It just moved elsewhere, to places where consumers in advanced economies were less likely to see it. So, if we hate the ongoing legacy of exploitative labor practice that grew from the Newsboys strike, why do we love a movie from 1992 that pretends that we licked that whole child labor problem back in 1899?
One of my favorite moments in Newsies is carved into my heart because I will never in 1,000 viewings be able to make sense of it. In the midst of the film's first rallying cry for labor rights, the world will know, the Newsies are singing about the justice and urgency of their cause. We'll do what we gotta do until we break the will of mighty Bill and Joe, Kelly cries. And Boots, who God bless him has some of the most consistently weird acting and delivery whenever he's on screen, stands up, front and center, standing above the newsboys and high in the mix, and delivers these two lines. And my name is Mud, and I can't stand blood. Or possibly, and their name is Mud, and they can't stand blood. The captions, I think, say, and my name is Mud, and they can't stand blood. It's really hard to tell what he says, because as with everything Boots does in this movie, he says it weird. In a way, this baffling contrast is the real message of Newsies, the power of the worker at odds with the weakness, fragility, and powerlessness. Just like Boots, the movie isn't sure what it's saying. It's moving its mouth and sounds are coming out, but the message is garbled, twisted by a Welsh teenager's imagining of what Gilded Age New Yorkers might have sounded like, filtered through the lens of a cruel media industry trying to make him sound stupid from 100 years in the past. And all the while, everyone is singing and dancing far too furiously to pay attention to the words that they're singing or saying or shouting. As with so much of Newsies, the politics are at the same time bad and good, the film somehow ascending above its own flaws, propelled by imperfection. Newsies is politically flawed, without question. Its failure is that it is a reification of itself. It is a story about media oligarchs Pulitzer and Hearst manipulating narratives to make stasis feel like progress. But it is also the attempt of media proto-monopoly Disney to manipulate the same narrative to make an old failure seem like an inspiring victory. But perhaps its greatest success, too, is that it is a reification of itself. It is a story of teenagers pushing back against the corporations that want to control them by making their own media, writing their own paper, publishing independently, and taking money out of Pulitzer's pockets. That's what happened in 1899, when the Newsboys Union printed a two-color handbill begging for readers to boycott the World and Journal, hawking its headlines on every corner and selling as many as they could print. And it happened again in the 1990s, as hordes of teenagers, myself included, saw no particular reason to see Newsies in the theater, but fell in love with it later on ragged, exhausted VHS copies passed around from hand to hand. Those teenagers made it their own, writing countless words of snitch skittery /fiction on fanfiction.net, throwing improvised school productions with neither script nor score, nothing but enthusiasm and flat caps left over from last year's production of Fiddler. So say it this way, the Newsies fandom in the 90s and aughts is a bunch of child laborers producing text in Disney's basement, distributed to teenagers by teenagers in a way that put very little money into Disney's pockets. Newsies built a loving, committed, creative fan base, and almost none of that love and enthusiasm generated any income for Disney. The unloved children of Newsies are our children now. Even more than a century later, the Newsboys of 1899 resist the efforts of corporate capital to own them, and they find the home instead in the hearts and voices of young people telling their own stories. And to me, at least, nothing proves this point as well as the Broadway musical. The fact that Disney made Newsies into a Broadway musical is, I would argue, an admission that for 2 decades, people loved this movie in a way that made Disney almost no money. They worked together to make their own art and stories, carrying the banner for this paradox of a film and loving these boys that capital could never quite control. I've never seen the musical, and I don't know if it's made Disney any money, but I kind of hope it hasn't. I'd rather the Newsies stay what they always wanted to be. Free as fishes, blowing every nickel as it comes. Home free all.
Thanks for watching, folks. As professors, our students would never forgive us if we didn't have a full works cited page linked in the description. We're a new channel, so if you've enjoyed our nonsense, please like and comment. If you want more of this to happen to you, subscribe and click the bell. You know how it works. If you want, you can support us at patreon.com/thenukes. No matter what, we appreciate you.